Hi, in this video recording I will try to explain you functions in C#, functions return type and parameters. Okay, a function is also called a method or procedure. A function is an instruction or set of instructions to achieve a specific goal or outcome in a program. A function have the following components: access modifier like public, private, protected, or internal, protected and internal, but most commonly these three access modifiers are used. Return type could be void when the function does not return anything to the caller. It could be int if the result or the return of a function is type integer. It could be float, double, string, or any or own user-defined type as well, which I will explain later in another video. The name of the function, a user-defined name of the function, and parameters, local variables to hold values. I call it local because these parameters are only accessible or can only be used in that specific scope of that function. Outside of that function, they are not available or they cannot be used. Not all functions require parameters. You can have functions with no parameters as well, which I'm going to explain you now with an example. This is a small program with one function here or method. Public is the access modifier, which make this function display name as public, available to anyone. Void is the return type. That means this function does a job and it does not return anything. And this is the user-defined name, display name of the function. And inside these parentheses, this string name is the parameter, and string is the type of this parameter. And here we have just one simple statement. The name of the employee is, that name is printed here. So the function, the role of this function is just to print whatever the name that you pass in this variable, and it prints that. Okay, let me explain all these with an example in a code. So let's open a new project in Visual Studio. Just look for a console. You can see several console, C#, Linux, Mac, as far as cross-platform compatible. Or you can use console which is just for Windows only, like this one. There are other console applications for F#, Visual Basic as well. But as we focus on C# programming language, so I prefer to choose this one for Windows, C#. Okay, you can choose this one as well, it doesn't make any difference. Let's go next. Now here, function, or well, in this specific situation, object-oriented programming is called method. So it's a method example. So that's our project name as well as the solution name for now. So let's create this project. Okay, that's our project created. Our project or namespace is method example. And this is the default program class that we have, and the main method, which is the starting point of our application. And these are all the namespaces available. Well, there are many others as well, but we can use them to do certain jobs for us. These namespaces have a lot of classes which help us. As you can see, they're all gray now. They're gray because these classes, their methods, their functionalities are not used. So once we start using them, you will see they will become active. For example, let's say I print here, let's say method in C# programming. Okay, that's something I'm printing on the screen. Just to hold the screen, I'm going to type one more statement here, just to hold the screen for us. Now look at this console write line. console.read key that belongs to the system. The system is active. Once I start using the generic and non-generic classes or language integrated code or text, read write or multi-threading, then you will see they will also be active. So at the moment I'm not using them, but as you can see they are available for us from C#. If I execute my code, just press Ctrl F5 or just press that button, you will see the outcome of this program when methods in C# programming. Right now, sorry, this is the default method main static void main, which is the starting point of our application. So let's focus on our own methods. So I'm going to create a method here that's going to be public void, let's say display. I can just say here, this is the display method. Okay, now if I run it, nothing will happen because this method is created here, but it's never called in the main method. You will only see this printed on the screen once you call the function. To call this function, I'm going to just say display, right? It's like calling a method or a function, right? Now it's not working. It's because within this class, if I'm using other methods and I'm calling it here, it's going to give me this error message. It says an object reference is required for the non-static field method or property program.display. So an object reference is required to use this function in this main method. We have a keyword that's called static. If I use static keyword, I don't need to create an instance for this method to call the function. I will explain this static keyword again in another video with full detail. It has a lot of advantages to us when we're creating static properties and methods. But at the moment, as you can see, I can call the display function within my main method without creating an instance for this class, right? So this is the display method, as you can see here on the screen. Right, let's come towards parameters now. Let's say I want to send this function a name parameter, right? Now as you can see, I created a parameter here string name. Now this function is giving me a red sign here. It says there is no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter name of display string. What does it mean? That this function that you are calling, it is expecting a name signature. So I'm going to call here, let's say David, right? Now I can just simply say this, the value in the name parameter is, I have plenty of ways to concatenate some values with a string. So I can use a simple plus sign or string interpolation. Let's use just this for now. Okay. So that name David, when I'm calling this function, that value will be sent to this parameter. And then that value will be available in this scope, as you can see, name. And here, I can print this on my screen. As you can see, the value in the name parameter is David. This kind of function has one parameter. Before that, I show you with no parameter. And this function has no return type. That means this function does not return anything to the caller, which is the main method here. It just calls the function, it does a job, and finish. Let me create another function here, which will take 2, 3, or as many as you want parameters. Let's create another one, public static, let's say float. I can create something, let's say add numbers. So I can write here some numbers, let's say float um, num1, float num2, and I can have float, let's say result. Okay. And I can just add these numbers just to make it as simple as possible. Num1, num2. And you see this function will keep giving me this red sign until I return a value of type float. Okay, so once I just type here return result, that error will go. See this one. Right. Now I go back to my main method. I'm going to call this function called add numbers. And I can simply pass here, let's say, two numbers float. And these numbers, 23 will come to num1 and 66 will come to num2. These numbers will be available here in these two variables. I will sum them. The result, the sum of these will be stored in this result variable, and that result variable will be passed here back to the main method. Now if I run this, nothing will be printed from that. The reason is that the values are received by these two parameters num1 and num2. They are summed together. The result is passed back to the main method, but there's nowhere we ask it to print it. So we can do a lot of things with this. I can just say float x or something I can store in this, and I can print x. Or I can, okay, let's do it like that. This app, okay, so the return of the, let's do another way, string interpolation. Let's say dollar sign. So the return of the add numbers. Well, actually, I'm calling this. No, not like this. Method is x. So the result that we received from this function is stored in x, and that x is printed. You will see the result now on the screen. Look, the return of the numbers method is 89. If you are new to taking the user input from the screen, I can show you that as well. Like, say, please enter a number. Okay, and then float num1, because you don't want these values to be always 23 or 66. You want to take the user input and pass it to this function. So for that, you can ask the user to please enter a number. That number will be entered, which you can take from the user in console.readline. Now the problem here is that console.readline by default is a string value, whatever you take the input from the user, whether a number, date, currency, float, double, or whatever. Then you have to store that value as type float, because my variable is type float. I can convert it into integer, char, double, decimal, or whatever you need. So I'm going to type here float.parse. So the user input will be converted into what is it? Float, and that will be stored in number1. I'm going to copy this and paste it here again for the second number. I can't have two numbers with the same name, of course, so I'm going to change it to num2. and here I would say please enter another number. So the first number taken from the user, converted, passed into float, stored in num1. The second number we took from the user, passed into float, stored in num2. Now this time I'm not going to send a hard-coded number like 2366 all the time. Instead of that, I'll make it num1 and num2. So now I'm calling this function, but when I'm calling it, I pass two variables with two values of type float. And these values are sent to this function. This function here, they receive the two values, sum them together, store the result in this variable, and return that result here to this line number 22. In x variable, that value is stored, and then I print x. The result that I receive, sometime we need this to use for other purposes. For example, that I'm adding 100 with the result, or multiplying with something, or dividing with something, or maybe this is a price coming from another function. For that, I want to find the VAT 20%, so I can multiply this with 0.20. No, sorry, not 0.20, 20%, that's going to be 20. Yeah, okay, yeah, 20 divided by 100, or that way. So we can do a lot of things with the result that we receive from this function, right? So what we did right now? We took the user input stored in num1. We took another user input. We passed to the float and stored in num2. Then that num1, num2 are sent to this function, which is down here. Okay, that value receive the items, and then that result is stored in x, and then that result x is printed here. Okay, let's run it and see. So now it's asking me to enter a number. Okay, I enter 56 and I enter 88. Now the return of the add numbers method is 244. So with this, what did you learn here? A function with access modifier, the static keyword, it helps us to call the function here without creating an instance for this program class. Then I show you how to pass a string parameter, receive it and print it in a void or display void this function, which return does not anything. Then the other one I show you example is public static float. Now this function returns type is float, right? It has two parameters now, num1 and num2. These two numbers are added, stored in the result, and returned here. Now there's another thing you should learn here is if I make this double, it should not be any problem. As you may already know, the what is called the data types here, that float is 4 bytes and double is 8 bytes. So this is not an issue here. You see, there's no problem here. All we did, it's kind of casting this from float into double, the result from float to double. So it's an explicit casting. We don't have to do explicit conversion from smaller type to big type. So no problem. The only problem is up here in the main method. Now the return of this function is no longer float. It's double. So the return from this expression that we have is type double. Now we can't store that double in the float because double is 8 bytes and float is 4 bytes. So either we can convert it back to float and store it in float, or we can change this type here to double. The point that I'm making here is a bit careful with the return types that you are use, and you should know more about the data types, like what are short, int, float, double, decimal, long, okay, sign and unsigned, what are their limits and how to use them, right? So that's what I show you now, the functions, the user inputs, converting into different types, and functions with access modifiers, a static keyword, return type, name of the function, and parameters. I hope that helped you guys to understand functions, return types, and anything related to this, and a bit about the data type. Thank you.